So I thought I'd start this video on Kant's deontological ethics by telling you a bit about the man himself so you know what you're in for. So Immanuel Kant was born in Königsberg in Germany, now known as Kaliningrad in Russia, in 1724. He lived there his entire life, he never married, and barely travelled more than a few miles from Königsberg ever. He was only about 5 foot tall and had a deformed chest, and Kant lived a very kind of rigid lifestyle, adhering to a strict routine. And the classic example of this routine is his daily walks. Kant took precisely the same walk at precisely the same time every day, and was so precise in doing this that the townspeople supposedly set their watches by him. At least that's the myth. So Kant was a university lecturer, and another story I heard about him was that he once refused to continue a lecture because one of his students had a button missing from his jacket and this was distracting him. In amongst his routine of lectures and walks, he wrote massive long complicated books like the Critique of Pure Reason. Let me read you a bit. The synthesis of the conditioned with its conditioned, and the whole series of the latter, does not, in the major premise, carry with it any limitation to time or any concept of succession. The empirical synthesis, on the other hand, that is the series of the conditions in appearance, as subsumed in the minor premise, is necessarily successive, the members of the series being given only as following upon one another in time. I have therefore, in this case, no right to assume the absolute totality of the synthesis, and of the series thereby represented. So imagine that for 700 pages and you've got the Critique of Pure Reason. But anyway, Kant is considered one of the all-time greats of philosophy. He's probably in that kind of S tier with the likes of Plato and Descartes. And Kant's moral philosophy, like the man himself, is similarly rigid. It's a deontological approach, which says that we have a duty to follow various moral rules, such as don't lie, don't steal, and so on. And while there's a bit of kind of convoluted reasoning to work out what these rules are, the theory isn't quite as complicated as you might expect from that introduction. So now you know a bit about the man himself, let's talk about Kant's deontological ethics. So deontology, as in Kant's deontological ethics, is all about duty. And for Kant, we have a duty to follow various moral rules, such as don't steal, don't lie, keep your promises, and so on. But before we get onto these rules, a bit more about duty and how this relates to what's morally good. So in the last video, we looked at utilitarianism and saw how utilitarianism, or at least hedonistic utilitarianism, defines good in terms of happiness or pleasure. But Kant would say that happiness or pleasure is not in itself a good thing. You know, if someone gets pleasure from torturing an animal, for example, then that pleasure is probably not a good thing. Likewise, knowledge is not good in itself because, you know, if you use your knowledge to build a bomb or whatever, then that's not good either. So whether pleasure or knowledge is considered a good thing according to Kant has to be qualified. Instead, he says the only thing that's good without qualification, that's good in itself, is the goodwill. So the goodwill, according to Kant, means to act for the sake of duty. And this just means to do your duty because it's your duty, or to do the right thing because it's the right thing and not for some other reason. So say somebody always tells the truth, they never lie, then this person is acting in accordance with duty because you have a duty never to lie. But he doesn't necessarily have goodwill if the reason he tells the truth is, for example, because he wants people to trust him or because it's good for business or whatever. So there's a kind of difference between the goodwill, which means to act for the sake of duty, and simply acting in accordance with duty. This is the difference between doing the right thing and doing the right thing because it's the right thing. So the goodwill means to act for the sake of duty, to follow the moral law and do the right thing because it's the right thing. But how do we know what the right thing is, and how do we know what these moral laws are? Well, that is where the categorical imperative comes in. In Kant's words, the categorical imperative says to act only according to that maxim, whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. Really had a way with words, didn't he? Anyway, in plain English, this is like saying to only act according to rules that you could want everybody to follow all the time. So whenever you make a decision, a moral decision, imagine Kant is there asking you, how would you like it if everybody did that? And that's essentially the categorical imperative. But this being Kant, it's never as simple as that. And so there's a bunch of additional jargon to go over. The first of which is this distinction between a contradiction in conception and a contradiction in will. And you can think of these as kind of two tests you can apply to your maxim, i.e. the rule you're acting on, to see whether it passes the categorical imperative, and thus whether it's morally acceptable according to Kant. So firstly, contradiction in conception. Let's say I'm in the shop and I want to steal a delicious drink from the fridge. My maxim here, the general rule that I'm acting on, would be to steal. So can I will that this maxim, to steal, be universalized, that everybody stole stuff all the time? No, says Kant, because if everybody followed the maxim to steal, if stealing was a universal rule that everybody followed all the time, then it wouldn't even be possible to steal. It leads to a contradiction in conception. So if you think about it, an act of stealing is to take something that belongs to somebody else, that they have a right over. But if stealing was a universal law, if it was always okay to take somebody else's property, then in what sense would it be their property for you to steal in the first place? If everybody's following this rule to steal, then I have just as much right over your stuff as you do over me. And so a world in which everybody can steal stuff all the time is a world in which nobody owns anything, where nobody has any property rights. And if nobody owns anything, then it's not even possible to steal. So the maxim to steal leads to a contradiction in conception. If everybody stole stuff as a general rule, then it wouldn't be possible. And so Kant says we have a perfect duty never to steal, that because it leads to a contradiction in conception, stealing is always wrong. The examples Kant gives of perfect duties or maxims that leads to contradictions in conception when universalized are don't lie or lie. Lying leads to a contradiction in conception is what I'm saying. So you have the perfect duty never to lie, and to keep your promises. Kant says, if you Kant gives the examples of keeping promises and never telling lies as other examples of perfect duties. So, like with the stealing example, Kant says that the maxim to lie, to tell a lie, leads to a contradiction in conception when universalized. And the reasoning is similar because the point or the end of telling a lie is to get the other person to believe you. But if everybody lied all the time, if lying was a universal maxim that everybody followed, then there's some sense in which it wouldn't be possible to tell a lie, because if the point of telling a lie is to get the other person to believe you, and everybody lied all the time, then no one would believe these lies. And so, again, there's a kind of contradiction in conception there. If everybody tells lies as a universal law or rule, then it's in some sense not possible to lie. and thus we also have a perfect duty never to lie. So again, if something leads to a contradiction in conception, such as stealing, lying, or breaking promises, then Kant says we have a perfect duty not to do that thing. In other words, this duty applies all the time. There's no exceptions, no whatever. So that was contradiction in conception, but if your maxim passes this first test, you're not okay to do it just yet, according to Kant. You next have to consider whether it leads to a contradiction in will, and Kant gives two examples to illustrate what he means by this: a duty for self-improvement and a duty to help other people. So let's look at the second example, our duty to help other people. So let's say somebody needs my help and they ask me to help them, but I can't be bothered. Well, my maxim here is not to help other people in need. So can this maxim, not to help other people, be universalized? Well, it doesn't lead to a contradiction in conception, like stealing or telling lies. So it passes this first test. But, says Kant, we still can't rationally will that the maxim not to help others be a universal law, because it's self-defeating in a different way. Although not logically contradictory, it contradicts our own kind of ends or goals or desires. So, for example, we often have goals or ends, as Kant would call them, that require the help of other people. As a baby, for example, you rely on the help of others to feed you. And so if you willed the maxim not to help other people, then it wouldn't be good, would it? Or let's say I'm sure you probably like living in a house, assuming you're not homeless. So your end or goal, you want to have a house basically, but you probably couldn't build a house all by yourself, for example. And so if you want a house, if that's your end or goal, then it would perhaps be self-defeating to will the maxim not to help others, because you wouldn't be able to achieve this end of having a house if everybody followed this maxim. If a maxim, when universalized, leads to a contradiction in will like this, if it creates a world that somehow contradicts our own ends and is self-defeating in the sense that it would prevent us from achieving these ends or achieving our goals, then Kant says it creates an imperfect duty. So in this example, we have an imperfect duty to help other people. And unlike a perfect duty, an imperfect duty means we have a duty to sometimes, though not always, follow this maxim. So we have a duty to sometimes help other people in need. A potential issue, I think, is that Kant doesn't really get too specific about when we should follow these imperfect duties and when we can ignore them. But anyway, in short, the categorical imperative, or at least this universal law formula that we've went over, you know what I'm saying, is all about acting according to maxims that could be applied universally. But Kant's not quite finished yet. One final bit of jargon to go over before we start evaluating the theory is that Kant gives a second formulation of the categorical imperative, known as the humanity formula or the end in itself formula. And this isn't something in addition to the categorical imperative or the universal law formula of the categorical imperative that we just went over. It's rather supposed to be a kind of more practical way of getting at the same point. Anyway, the humanity formula says, act in such a way that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of another, always at the same time as an end and never simply as a means. Anyway, the humanity formula basically just says don't use people. So Kant applies the humanity formula to the same examples as he did with the universal law formula that we went over previously, and he gets the same results. So telling lies, for example. I don't know where this example came from, if I made it up myself or, it's some example. Perhaps let me know if you know where it comes from. Anyway, imagine you lie to some old widow and pretend to love her in order to marry her and get her money. Well, in this case, you're using this person as a means to achieve your end of getting money. The person you're marrying might have the end or the goal of finding a partner who genuinely loves them, but by lying to them, you're removing their ability to choose this end. If this person had all the information, if you told them the truth, then they might choose to act differently. If you told them the truth, they might not want someone who just is marrying them for their money. Presumably they wouldn't. But by lying to this person, you're depriving them of the ability to make this choice. You're kind of undermining their autonomy as a rational being and undermining their ability to achieve their own ends. So you're treating this person solely as a means to get money without acknowledging the other person's ends or goals, which might conflict with yours. Just as a bit of extra detail, you might be thinking that we use people as means to ends all the time. So, for example, you might say that when I bought this alien, that I use the shopkeeper as a means to achieve my end of acquiring an alien. But this doesn't violate the humanity formula because although I did in some sense use the shopkeeper as a means, I did so whilst acknowledging the shopkeeper's own end, which was presumably to make a profit. I mean, you could just as easily argue that the shopkeeper used me as a means to make a profit. And so this example, where you're buying an alien, doesn't violate the humanity formula because you're doing a deal, you're doing a fair deal where each side acknowledges the end of the other person. So whilst there is in some sense in which you use the other person as a means, you're not treating them solely as a means. You're treating them as a means whilst acknowledging their own ends. In my case, to get an alien, and in the shopkeeper's case, to make a profit. If I stole the alien, for example, then that would be a different story because in that case, I'm not acknowledging the shopkeeper's own ends. I'm not giving the shopkeeper an opportunity to have a say in the matter. You know, even if he'd have willingly given me the alien for free, by stealing it from him, I'm kind of removing his ability to make a choice, and so I'm undermining his rational agency and failing to acknowledge the shopkeeper as someone who has their own ends or their own goals. So the upshot of the theory, whether it be the universal law formula or the humanity formula of the categorical imperative, is that we end up with a bunch of moral laws or maxims for action. You know, don't steal, don't lie, keep your promises, and so on. And this is essentially what morality is according to Kant. We have a duty to follow these moral laws. So the first objection to Kant's deontological ethics goes back to this idea of the goodwill. And if you remember from a second ago, the goodwill means to act for the sake of duty. So the goodwill, according to Kant, means to act for the sake of duty. See? And Kant says that goodwill is the source of moral worth. Again, if you do the right thing because you want to, then you don't necessarily have goodwill. Even though your actions are in accordance with duty and you do the right thing, your actions aren't necessarily good because you don't have the goodwill. They're not motivated by duty. So let's put this account to the test with a few examples. So imagine two fathers, Father A and Father B. And let's use the same example from the previous video of teaching your daughter how to ride a bicycle. So Father A genuinely loves his daughter and enjoys spending time with her, and that's why he teaches her to ride her bike, because he loves her and enjoys seeing her learn and grow. Whereas Father B doesn't love his daughter. Perhaps he even hates spending time with her, and yet he teaches his daughter how to ride her bike anyway because he recognises he has a duty to do so. So who's the better father here? Father A, who teaches his daughter how to ride his bike because he loves her, or Father B, who teaches his daughter how to ride her bike because he has a duty to do so? I think most people would have the intuition that it's better, father A is the better father. It's better to teach your daughter to ride a bicycle and spend time with your children, for example, out of genuine love, rather than simply because you have a duty to do so. Or at the very least, that father A's actions here are good, that it's good that father A loves his daughter and teaches her to ride her bike because he loves her. But Kant's theory says the opposite. Although father A's actions are in accordance with duty, they're not necessarily morally praiseworthy or good because they're not motivated by duty. Instead, Kant would say that father B, the father who spends time with his daughter purely out of duty, despite the fact that he doesn't love her, is the better father and the more morally desirable situation. Because again, father B has the goodwill, even though he doesn't actually love his daughter. Another quick example to illustrate this point. So imagine you're ill in hospital and your friend comes to visit you. How would you feel if they told you that the only reason they were visiting you was because they had a duty to? That they didn't actually care how you're doing, but they just forced themselves to come visit you because it was the right thing to do? That would probably be a bit awkward, wouldn't it? And so this is the objection. The objection is that there are other motivations that have moral worth besides the goodwill. That it's good to spend time with your daughter because you genuinely love her, for example. Or that it's good to spend time with your friends and visit them when they're in hospital, for example, because of friendship and because you genuinely care about them. That these motivations are inherently good and morally valuable. Whereas Kant's theory says these motivations have no moral worth. The only morally good motivation is the goodwill, to be motivated by duty. And so Kant's theory is perhaps overly cold and calculating in that it ignores the goodness and moral value of motivations such as love, friendship and kindness. So I don't know if this objection was put to Kant while he was alive or if he wrote anything about it, but Kant's response to this objection would again probably focus on this difference between acting in accordance with duty and acting for the sake of duty. Kant would surely say there's nothing wrong with being motivated by these other factors. There's nothing wrong with being motivated by love or friendship or kindness or whatever, as long as we don't choose our actions for the sake of these other motivations, as long as we always choose our actions for the sake of duty. Here's one way we might defend Kant's stance here. So, returning to the example of the two fathers who teach their daughters how to ride their bike. Remember, father A teaches his daughter how to ride her bike because he genuinely loves her, whereas father B does so out of duty. Well, Kant might say, if father A is only motivated by love and how he feels for his daughter, then what happens if he's having a bad day, say, and he doesn't feel this strong love for his daughter anymore? Well, in that case, presumably he would no longer do the right thing. If his motivation is only love and enjoyment of spending time with his daughter, then if that motivation is no longer there, then you can't rely on him to do the right thing. Whereas father B, okay, it's not ideal that he kind of hates his life and doesn't enjoy spending time with his daughter and doesn't love her. While that's not ideal, you can at least rely on father B to do the right thing because he has the goodwill. He does the right thing because it's the right thing, regardless of how he feels and regardless of his emotions. Kant would also say that we can't control our emotions. We can't choose whether we feel love for our family, for example, or choose to feel genuine concern for our friend who's ill in hospital. And so it's unfair to call someone a bad person or assign moral blame to them for lacking these motivations. And by the same token, we can't praise someone for feeling love or care for others because this isn't something they have control over. Instead, Kant would say morality and duty are about what we're in control of, i.e. our actions. And goodwill means that we'll choose the morally correct actions, that we'll do what's right, at least to the fullest extent we're able to. Perhaps we can imagine a third option, father C, who is motivated by duty and has the goodwill, but also loves his daughter. So Father C's decision to teach his daughter how to ride her bike, for example, would essentially be overdetermined. He chooses to spend time with his daughter because of duty, and so he has the goodwill, and so he's morally praiseworthy according to Kant. But even if he didn't have the goodwill, he'd still choose to spend time with his daughter anyway because he also loves her and would be motivated by love. So this is kind of the best of both worlds. He's motivated by duty, but he also loves his daughter. So in general, Kant doesn't have a problem with being motivated by these other factors such as love, friendship and kindness and so on, as long as we don't choose our actions because of these motivations, as long as we're ultimately motivated by duty. But I suppose if you really wanted to push this objection, you could point out that Kant would have a hard time saying that Father C, the one who both loves his daughter and has the goodwill, is any better than Father B, the one who doesn't love his daughter but has the goodwill. Because again, Kant's theory assigns no moral value to the motivations of love, friendship and kindness and so on. And so, given that both fathers are equally motivated by duty, Kant kind of doesn't have any grounds to say that one is better than the other. Anyway, let's move on to the next objection. Okay, so moving on to the actual maxims implied by Kant's theory, the moral rules for action. We might ask, what do we do in the case of a conflict between duties, a situation where two maxims contradict each other? For example, we saw how Kant would say we have a perfect duty never to steal, because the maxim to steal something leads to a contradiction in conception. In a world where everybody follows the maxim to steal, it's not possible to steal because the concept of private property would break down. Similarly, Kant says we have a perfect duty to always keep our promises, because if everybody always broke their promises, then it wouldn't be the point of making a promise would break down, because the point of making a promise is to get someone to trust that you'll do what you say. But if everybody broke their promises as a matter of universal law, if everybody just always broke their promises, then the concept of making a promise would have no meaning. And so again, this leads to a contradiction in conception. So here we have two perfect duties, a perfect duty never to steal and a perfect duty to keep our promises. So what happens if the only way you can keep your promise is to steal something? What if, for example, you promised to get your friend a copy of Metalogic, an introduction to the meta-theory of standard first-order logic by Jeffrey Hunter, but some maniac has bought all the copies of Metalogic in the world and is hoarding them for himself? A bit like, if you've seen it, those people who were buying all the copies of Jerry Maguire on VHS to build a pyramid out of them. And so the only way you can keep your promise is by stealing from this maniac. Or perhaps more simply, you promise to steal something for your friend. And again, you have a perfect duty never to steal, and you have a perfect duty to keep your promise. But whichever action you take is going to mean violating a perfect duty. If you keep your promise, then you violate your duty never to steal. But if you break your promise, well, then you violate that duty as well. Those are your only two options, aren't they? You either steal it and keep your promise, or you don't steal it and you break your promise. And so the theory is kind of impossible. Well, you might argue that the theory is kind of impossible to follow in practice because it can create these conflicting duties, these contradictory duties that are impossible to follow. So in response to this challenge, Kant argues that a true conflict between duties is impossible. He says, if it is a duty to act in accordance with one rule, to act in accordance with the opposite rule is not a duty, but even contrary to duty. And so a collision of duties and obligations is inconceivable. So if you think there's a conflict between duties, Kant would say, that's just because you haven't worked out what your duties actually are. After all, our duties are about what we could rationally will that everybody follow. And as mentioned, we can't rationally will that everybody follow conflicting duties because that's not logically possible. If we worked out what our duties were properly, we'd work out duties that are perfectly consistent and without contradiction, Kant would say. So, returning to the example a minute ago, Kant would say the error was in making the promise in the first place. Again, morality is all about acting according to maxims that we will become universal laws. And the promise to steal something cannot be made into a universal law because it contradicts our duty never to steal. And so there's some sense in which we have a duty not to promise to steal things because it can't be made into a universal law. And so Kant would say a promise to steal something or a promise to lie or whatever is an invalid promise because these promises can't be made into universal laws without contradiction. I suppose the meta-logic and Jerry Maguire examples are a bit different because it's not like you're explicitly making a promise to steal. It just turns out that the only way you can keep this promise is by stealing. It seems a bit harsh basically to accuse someone of not formulating their duties correctly because how are they supposed to know when they make the promise that this person has bought up all the copies of meta-logic? But anyway. Further, in Metaphysics of Morals, Kant talks about the grounds of our obligations. And he says, when two such grounds conflict with one another, practical philosophy says that the stronger ground of obligation prevails. And applied to the promising to steal example, the grounding of the promise is weaker than the grounding of the duty not to steal. The grounding of our duty not to steal is categorical. It applies to people at all times and all places. It can't be overruled. Whereas the grounding for the promise here is one that's created by the person themselves. And so the grounding for this particular obligation is weaker than the grounding for our duty not to steal. And so the former must give way to the latter. Again, the promise is invalid. Notice that I've only talked about conflicting perfect duties here. Duties that arise when our action leads to a contradiction in conception when universalized. And this is because this is the more juicy criticism because Kant says we always have to follow perfect duties, that there's no exceptions. And so if there's a conflict between perfect duties, then this is a big problem for the theory. Whereas if you had a imperfect duty that conflicted with a perfect duty, this would presumably be quite easy to solve because whereas we always have to follow perfect duties, imperfect duties are something we sometimes follow. And so the imperfect duty would presumably give way to the perfect duty. As for a clash of imperfect duties, if such a thing could arise, I don't know if Kant says anything on this, but again, he doesn't really say much about when we don't have to follow imperfect duties, which is potentially a different criticism altogether, that Kant's kind of vague about when we should follow imperfect duties and when it's okay not to follow imperfect duties. But anyway, that's the conflicting duties objection. Let's move on to the next one. So again, for the 100th time, morality is all about universalizability for Kant. If your maxim can be applied universally, then it's morally permissible. But if your maxim can't be willed as a universal law, like lying or stealing, then it's wrong according to Kant. So bad equals not universalizable, and good, or at least morally permissible, is universal. Means, you know what I'm saying? The Venn diagram basically for Kant is that if something can be universalized, then it's morally acceptable. Whereas if it can't be universalized, then it's morally bad, according to Kant. So this next objection questions whether this really is how it works, whether the Venn diagrams really do fall this way. So can we think of examples of things that are either morally wrong but can be universalized, or things that can't be universalized but aren't morally wrong? So let me give you some examples. We've already established that stealing is wrong according to Kant because the maxim to steal leads to a contradiction in conception when universalized. But what about if we say my maxim, I'm in the shop again and I like the look of the drink, and so I'm thinking I want to steal that drink. Well, obviously I can't steal the drink if my maxim is to steal. But what if I say my maxim is to steal from shops on a Wednesday morning when your name is Christian? Well, in that case, my maxim, what did I say? To steal from shops on a Wednesday morning when your name is Christian. This maxim can be universalized. The maxim would apply so rarely that it wouldn't lead to a breakdown in the concept of private property like the stealing example did. And so, in theory, Kant should say that it's morally permissible. But just because it's a Wednesday and your name is Christian doesn't make it okay to steal. So this kind of challenges this relationship between universalizability and morality that Kant's theory insists on. In response to this example, Kant would probably point out that these extra conditions, the time of day and my name, are morally irrelevant to my choice here. They're not really part of my maxim. So, I don't choose what time of day it is, and I don't choose what my name is. And so adding in these extra conditions isn't part of my actual maxim. If we were to apply the categorical imperative to my real maxim, which is to steal, then we get the correct answer, that it's wrong to steal the drink or whatever, regardless of whether your name is Christian or if it's a Wednesday morning or whatever. But we can push this objection further with other examples. So where stealing from shops on Wednesday morning when your name is Christian was an example of a maxim that can be universalized but is morally wrong, we can come up with examples of things that aren't morally wrong but that can't be universalized. So Hegel, for example, argued that the maxim to give money to the poor can't be universalized because if everybody gave money to the poor as a general rule, then there'd be no poor people left because we'd have given them the money. And so the maxim to help the poor can't be universalized because it leads to a contradiction in conception. If everybody gives money to the poor, then there's no poor left to give to, and so you can't do it. So Kant should say that giving money to poor people is morally wrong because it leads to a contradiction in conception. But it's clearly not wrong to give money to the poor. It's good even. And so this again challenges this link between universalizability and morality, because giving money to the poor can't be universalized, but it's not morally wrong. It's morally good even. Or I'm taking the big test and my goal is to score in the top 10% of students. So my maxim for action is to be in the top 10% of the class or whatever. Well, again, this maxim can't be universalized because by definition, only 10% of the people can be in the top 10% of the class. It's not possible for everybody to follow this maxim. And so, again, Kant would have to say that trying to score in the top 10% of the students is morally wrong because it can't be universalized. But again, this seems wrong. Like, there's nothing wrong with wanting to be a good student and score in the top 10% of the class. So maybe my example of stealing from shops on Wednesday mornings when your name is Christian was a bit of a cheap move. But the point it makes, that universalizability and morality are not necessarily the same thing, potentially remains. If we can point to examples of things that are morally wrong but can be universalized, or things that can't be universalized that aren't morally wrong, then this suggests that Kant's categorical imperative is not the correct account of morality. That just because something is universalizable, it doesn't mean it's morally acceptable, as Kant says, or just because something can't be universalized, that it's morally wrong. So the most obvious objection to Kant's deontological ethics, certainly from a utilitarian perspective, is that it ignores the consequences of an action. So in the last video, we looked at utilitarianism, the theory which says that what makes things good or bad are the consequences. And while there are potential issues for utilitarianism, such as that it could justify, say, torturing an innocent person to please a large crowd, most people nevertheless have an intuition that consequences are morally important. So in that last video, I gave the example of stealing a loaf of bread from billionaire Jeff Bezos when you're starving, and stealing is the only way to avoid starving to death. I think most people have the intuition that in such extreme circumstances like that, where it literally means the difference between life and death, then stealing is morally acceptable. But of course, Kant says we have a perfect duty never to steal, that stealing is never acceptable under any circumstances. And so Kant would say you can't steal the loaf of bread from Jeff or steal anything, even if doing so would save your life. And it's the same with lying. Kant says we have a perfect duty never to lie. We can't lie under any circumstances. And Kant's commitment to this principle was put to the test by a French philosopher called Benjamin Constant, who put the following example to Kant. So imagine you see your friend being chased by a would-be murderer. They've got a knife and bloodstained clothes or whatever, and there's no doubt that they intend to kill your friend. And so your friend's knocking at your door and you let them hide from the murderer in your house. But then a few minutes later, you hear a knock at the door and it's the murderer who asks you if your friend, who he intends to kill, is there in the house. So is it really wrong to lie in this scenario, given that the consequences mean life or death? Is telling lies really such a strict rule that we can't even break it, even if it means to avoid somebody being murdered? So, like I mentioned, this exact example was put to Kant while he was alive by Benjamin Constant. And Kant's response is to stick to his guns, that you have to tell the truth even if it means somebody dying. I think Kant does say somewhere that in this particular example, saying nothing is an option, that remaining silent is consistent with the categorical imperative. But that's beside the point. The point is that Kant sticks to his guns and says that perfect duties are exactly that. They are perfect, that you can never violate a perfect duty, even in a situation like this. Just as a bit of a random side note, that film, if you've seen it, Liar Liar, was on telly the other day. I can't lie! And I was chuckling to myself thinking about, it's basically Kant, isn't it? You can't tell a lie ever.
Is it good for you?
I've had better.
Kant says that any instance of lying, however small, harms humanity because it would bring it about that statements in general find no credence, and hence also that all rights based on contracts become void and lose their force. And this is a wrong done to mankind in general. Perhaps a less kind of abstract way of defending telling the truth in this scenario is to argue that it's very difficult to predict the consequences of our actions. And we talked a bit about this in the previous video. Saving a baby's life might increase pleasure in the short term, but what if that baby grew up to become a serial killer? Then in that case, saving the baby's life might actually decrease net pleasure overall. Anyway, Kant says a few things along these lines in response to Constant and the murderer at the door scenario. So imagine the same scenario as before. Your friend asks to hide in your house, and then the murderer asks you if he's in your house. Well, imagine this time that your friend, unbeknownst to you, snuck out of your house and actually went to the house next door, say. And so you lie to the murderer, or at least you think you lie to the murderer, and say he went next door. And so as a result of this lie, the murderer actually finds your friend and kills them. Well, Kant says in this scenario, if you try to act for the sake of consequences, then you should be held partly responsible for those consequences. If you lie or try to deceive somebody and something bad happens as a result of that deception, then you're responsible, at least partly, for those consequences. Whereas if you stick to duty and tell the truth, you can never be kind of blamed for your actions because you're doing what's right. And returning to the goodwill, remember Kant says that the goodwill is the only thing that's good without qualification, that consequences are not good without qualification. You know, again, if you save somebody's life and that person goes on to massacre 10,000 people, then saving that life wasn't such a great thing after all. So in short, Kant sticks to his guns and says that morality isn't about consequences. Morality is about goodwill and duty and following maxims that can be made into universal laws. It's not our job to anticipate the consequences of our actions. Our job is only to act for the sake of duty and to do the right thing because it's the right thing. If we follow these universal maxims, such as don't lie, don't steal, and so on, then we do the right thing, regardless of the consequences that result from following these maxims. I suppose we could push this objection further though by kind of upping the stakes of the example. So let's say some maniac has got a bomb that could kill everybody on planet Earth, and he says to Kant, you know, tell a lie or I'm going to kill everybody on planet Earth. And his only motivation for doing this is just because he wants to test Kant's dedication to the categorical imperative. And he means it, like he's going to kill everybody unless all Kant has to do is say like, I don't know, this is a dog, and he saves everybody on planet Earth. You know, obviously the right thing to do if he really means business is, you know, to tell a little lie there because it saves everybody on planet Earth. But I think Kant would probably dig his heels in even in this scenario and tell the truth, which maybe you could say is a weakness of the theory. One final objection we're going to look at today comes from Philippa Foot. And Philippa Foot focuses in on Kant's distinction between the categorical imperative, i.e. the moral law, and hypothetical imperatives. So hypothetical imperatives are conditional, they are a means to an end. So for example, you should study hard if you want to do well in the exam is a hypothetical imperative because it's conditional on you wanting to do well in the exam. If you don't care about doing well in the exam, if that isn't your end, then you don't have to accept the imperative that you should study. Likewise, you should leave now if you want to catch the 3 o'clock train. That's a hypothetical imperative because if you don't care about catching the 3 o'clock train, then you don't have to leave now. So hypothetical imperatives are conditional and kind of means to an end. And if you don't accept the end or the condition, then you don't have to accept the imperative. But morality, according to Kant, doesn't work like this. Morality is categorical rather than hypothetical. Rules such as don't steal, don't lie, and so on aren't something that apply to some people but not others. They're not a means to an end or something that we can choose to either accept or not accept depending on our goals or desires. Instead, they're something that apply to everybody at all times, regardless of situation. A categorical imperative, says Kant, declares an action to be of itself objectively necessary without reference to any other purpose. And at first glance, this distinction appears to fit with how we use our language. So for example, should means something very different in a context like you should leave now if you want to get back before 6 versus a context like you should not steal or you should not lie. The former is a hypothetical should that is conditional on our goals and desires, where we typically think of the latter as a kind of moral should that again applies to all people categorically. But Foot gives a few examples that question how deep this difference really is. So she gives a few examples of rules of etiquette to illustrate this. For example, that handshakes should be brief. This imperative that handshakes should be brief looks grammatically similar to moral imperatives such as you should help others in need or you should not steal. There's no hypothetical dimension to either the rules of etiquette or to moral laws. Even if you don't care about the rules of etiquette, for example, if you don't care about looking like a weirdo, then it's still a breach of etiquette to carry on shaking someone's hand for an awkwardly long period of time. What then makes the rules of etiquette, such as don't shake people's hands for too long, any different from moral rules such as don't steal? Why is it more important to follow a moral rule, such as don't steal, than it is to follow the rules of etiquette, such as don't shake people's hands for too long? What reason do we have to follow the rules of morality that we don't have to follow the rules of etiquette? There's no kind of hypothetical element to the rules of etiquette, and so what makes the rules of etiquette any different from moral laws? Why do we feel that a moral law, such as don't steal, is somehow different from the rule of etiquette, such as don't shake people's hands for too long? The answer, Foot says, is nothing. We might feel that the rules of morality are somehow more important than the rules of etiquette, but this feeling is just that, it's just a feeling. We might feel that there's this kind of inescapable moral force that compels us to follow rules such as don't steal, don't lie, and so on, and this force isn't present in the case of etiquette. But again, this feeling is just that, it's just a feeling. And Foot says this might just be a kind of psychological fact due to the way we're taught that moral rules are more important than the rules of etiquette. Now, Kant says the reason to follow the categorical imperative is a matter of rationality, that it's in some sense irrational to steal or tell lies because these actions lead to contradictions when universalized. But Foot says, why should committing a certain action such as stealing or lying mean that you necessarily will everybody else to act in the same way? Couldn't it be the case that you are happy for you to steal something or for you to lie whilst willing that everybody else tells the truth and doesn't steal? There's nothing irrational or inconsistent about that. Such a person, says Foot, could be convicted of villainy but not of inconsistency. There's nothing irrational about stealing or lying if you never accepted these rules for yourself in the first place. To put it simply, Foot says that Kant doesn't provide any real reason why we shouldn't lie or why we shouldn't steal, that categorical imperatives don't give us any motivation to follow them. It's only hypothetical imperatives, such as you should study hard if you want to do well in the exam, or you should leave now if you want to get there on time. It's only these hypothetical imperatives that provide us a reason to act a certain way. Categorical imperatives give us no reason to follow them, and so Kant gives us no reason why we should follow rules such as don't steal, don't lie, or whatever. So does this mean we should just abandon our duties and go around lying and stealing and killing or whatever? Well, not necessarily, says Foot. Our motivations for acting morally are better understood hypothetically, she says. We might help other people because we genuinely care about them, for example, and this care provides a hypothetical reason, a motivation to act correctly. And we might accept any number of hypothetical moral ends, such as truth or freedom or justice. And accepting these hypothetical moral ends, that's what motivates us to do the right thing. Not some long-winded rationale about universal laws, contradictions in conception, rationality, and so on, as Kant claims. So, Foot says that the moral law does not itself provide a reason to follow it, as Kant claims. But there are still, nevertheless, hypothetical reasons why we should follow these moral laws, such as don't steal, don't lie, and so on. And this kind of brings us back to the other valuable motivations issue that we started with. If you remember, Father A taught his daughter how to ride a bike because he genuinely loved her and he cared about her, whereas Father B did so for the sake of duty. A father who teaches his daughter how to ride a bicycle because he genuinely cares about her and because he loves her still does the right thing, even if he's never given a moment's thought to whether his maxim passes the categorical imperative and can be universalized, whether it leads to a contradiction in conception, or all these other notions. Even if he's never given a moment's thought to duty, we would still say that Father A behaves morally. And so, where Kant says it's all about acting for the sake of duty, we might agree with Foot that really morality is more about accepting these hypothetical moral ends. That it's fine to do your duty for the sake of caring about others, or any number of these other hypothetical moral ends, such as truth, freedom, justice, or whatever. So, to summarise Kant's deontological ethics, the only thing that is good without qualification, i.e. that's good in itself, is the goodwill. And goodwill means acting for the sake of duty, choosing to do what's right because it is the right thing to do. When we act, says Kant, we act according to maxims. These maxims are the general rule that would describe our action. The categorical imperative, or at least the universal law formulation, provides two tests we can apply to see whether our maxim can be made a universal law. If it can't be applied universally, then it's morally wrong. Firstly, does it lead to a contradiction in conception? For example, telling a lie. If everybody lied, then no one would believe lies, which defeats the purpose of telling a lie in the first place. And so, willing the maxim to tell lies as a universal law is in some sense self-defeating or self-contradictory. And this creates a perfect duty never to tell lies. Then the next test is whether it leads to a contradiction in will. For example, the maxim not to help other people can be universalized without leading to a contradiction in conception. But Kant says we can't rationally will that everybody follow this maxim not to help other people, because it would defeat our own goals or ends. We sometimes require the help of other people, and so if everybody followed this maxim not to help other people, then we wouldn't be able to receive help ourselves, and so it would defeat our own purposes, our own desires. As such, Kant says we have an imperfect duty to help other people. In addition to this universal law formulation of the categorical imperative, Kant provides the humanity formula as a kind of different or more practical way of working out our duties. And the humanity formula says not to treat people solely as means, but always as ends. So that's the theory, and then we looked at some objections, such as how Kant's account of the goodwill leaves no room for other morally valuable motivations, such as love or friendship. So for example, Kant would say there's nothing morally praiseworthy or good about going to visit your friend in hospital simply because you care about them. If you're not motivated by duty, then your actions have no moral worth, but this seems perhaps counterintuitive. We also considered some counterexamples to the categorical imperative, the idea that morality is all about universal laws and that universal laws define morality. For example, aiming to be in the top 10% of the class can't be made into a universal law, but there's nothing morally wrong with aiming to be in the top 10% of the class. Or a different way we might challenge the link between universal laws and morality is by appealing to consequences. Because lying can't be made into a universal law, Kant says that telling lies is always wrong regardless of the consequences. But this means you can't tell a lie to save someone's life or even to save the lives of everybody on planet Earth, and this is perhaps a bit too extreme. So that's Kant's deontological ethics in a nutshell. It's often contrasted against utilitarianism as kind of the opposite theory, because where utilitarianism's insistence on consequences means we end up kind of ignoring principles and intentions, Kant's theory kind of goes the other way, in that in Kant's rigid insistence on principles and intentions, we end up ignoring the consequences of our actions. And so I think most people kind of have the intuition that neither of these approaches, either the extreme consequentialist approach or the extreme kind of rule-based deontological approach, provides the perfect account of morality. These theories are too black and white, and they fail to account for the sort of nuances and subtleties of everyday life, these kind of grey areas. And so the next theory we're going to look at, Aristotle's virtue ethics, is all about these grey areas. It's all about the context and the situation and the person. It's a much more flexible approach with no absolute rules. So maybe we really will solve morality once and for all with that episode. I guess tune in to find out. So that's about it for Kant's Deontological Ethics. I hope you enjoyed it. Just a quick rundown of the books as always, then we can get out of here. So as always, you can get my book. This is the new version, the 3rd edition, which has better explanations and pictures, more pictures. So if you have an old version, you must destroy it immediately and get the latest version. But as for primary sources, Kant wrote like a bunch of books on the same topic and with very similar titles. So if you want to learn more about Kant's ethics, you can get the Critique of Practical Reason, not to be confused with the Critique of Pure Reason, of course. The Metaphysics of Morals, which is not this book. I actually bought this book by mistake thinking it was the Metaphysics of Morals, but of course it's the Metaphysics of Morals and Ethics by... basically it's the wrong book, so thanks Kant. And probably the only one I would recommend if you like reading this stuff, Grounding for the Metaphysics of Morals and Ethics. Again, not to be confused with the Metaphysics of Morals and Ethics, of course. And this is quite a short essay or pamphlet or book, whatever you want to call it. And even then it's still pretty bit of a slog. But yeah, this is what I base this video around. Probably, I can't say I've read all these other ones, but this is probably the one to get. Not particularly long. I think it's the one that everybody tends to reference. And what's good about my version I have here, it has on a supposed right to lie because of philanthropic concerns, which is the essay or the letter where Kant responds to Benjamin Constant and his murderer at the door example. So this one gets a... I'll also link any web pages you might find useful. That will include the page on my website that talks about this stuff. The Stanford page is probably quite good, although they can be a bit wordy sometimes. And I'll also link Philippa Foot's paper, Morality as a System of Hypothetical Imperatives, that I've referenced earlier. But yeah, that about does it for this video. So I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you in the next one.